here today. This is our first public policy luncheon of a very busy semester. Oh my goodness. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. We're going to talk about this very academic, esoteric topic of the 2024 election today. The title of the talk is the 2024 election in historic perspective. And so I imagine we'll have a lot of discussion and questions that I'm looking forward to getting to. I'm also thrilled to have Sean Trende here today to give this speech. He is a senior elections analyst at RealClearPolitics and also a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I see that maybe you're keeping a secret that you have a PhD in political science. I'm going to spill that secret. My name is Andrew Reeves. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Wiedenbaum Center. It's great to see old and new friends here today. We also have folks both on Zoom as well as live streaming this on YouTube. We have about 75 undergraduates from one of my classes who will be streaming live and who will be posting questions on a class message board that I might relay at some point. So I think everybody knows what the center does. We fund social sciences here at WashU. Much of that is work that we're able to do because of support from our donor group. That's you all, so I thank you all for that. We also really strive to bridge the academic and public divide with nonpartisan, informed, research-informed information. So if you have friends, family members, please invite them to our events. And so on that note, I'm going to hand it over briefly to Steve Knight, who's going to talk a little bit more about Wiedenbaum Center membership.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm pretty much going to reiterate what Andrew said, but I want to start with a welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out. Those of you on Zoom as well as in the room, we're just so delighted to continue this amazing lineup this fall. As co-chair of the membership committee with Molly Klein, who is probably out there in Zoom land, and on behalf of the committee, we really would like to invite all of you to bring friends, family, colleagues, be thinking about who might get excited by the kind of presentations that the Wiedenbaum Center is bringing to the public. And I just want to say a word about why I and my wife have found the Wiedenbaum Center to be such a compelling area of involvement in our lives. As we see every day, the ability to have access to in-depth, evidence-based research that's nonpartisan, that engages thought and discussion across many dividing lines and spectrums is more and more scarce and more important. The cross-disciplinary nature of the Wiedenbaum Center with poli-sci, economics, and sociology is just amazing. We get those cross perspectives, and not only do we support that research, but we get the benefit of hearing the researchers present to us, kind of bridging that think tank aspect to us as engaged community members. So it's a really cool thing. We take it for granted because we've been participating, but it's unusual, a rarity, a gem, and please invite your friends to come to the lineup that you find on your chairs this fall. But we got James Bullard this week. Incredible. Thank you all.
All right. So before I introduce Sean, I just want to let you guys know that Sean will give a presentation and then we'll have time to ask Q&A. Please raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. That's important so everybody in here can hear, but even more so our friends on Zoom and YouTube can also hear. So even if you have a nice loud voice, please wait for the microphone to reach you. Okay, so now I'll introduce Sean. Dr. Sean Trende is a senior elections analyst at RealClearPolitics and is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His work focuses on elections, American political trends, voting patterns, and demographics. And I really encourage you, if you don't read his columns on RealClearPolitics, they're really, really fantastic. Before becoming a full-time political analyst, Dr. Trende practiced law for 8 years. He is the co-author of the Almanac of American Politics 2014 and the author of The Lost Majority. Is the sound working okay? Can everybody hear everything? Okay. And the author of The Lost Majority, Why the Future of Government is Up for Grabs and Who Will Take It. Please join me in welcoming Sean Trende.
Okay, is this mic on? Yeah, let me adjust it real quick. All right. Well, thank you all for having me, and thank you for that kind introduction. I will try to live up to the hype. I see that you have a speech of your own on November 12th, the 2024 election results. You're an optimist. I hope we have results by November 12th, but as we'll see, We'll see. So the topic of the speech is the 2024 election in historical perspective. This title was agreed upon in early July. Things have changed. So I have a couple of... Yeah, I have a voice. I'll step back a little too. Can people still hear me if I step back? All right. So things have changed since then. So there's a few alternate titles that I bounced around. There's the election. There's the if we weren't choosing a leader of the free world, this would be the greatest election ever election. But in honesty, it's a little hard to place this election in historic perspective because our situation is just unprecedented. I've been using this picture for like 8 years of presentations. I just have to keep it around because it just works on so many levels. All right, so I have a couple goals for today. The first is to impress upon you why you should still trust the polls, because that's probably the #1 question I get when I give presentations as an elections analyst for RealClearPolitics. You know, we've had some rough years in polling. So I'm going to give some context to that, and then we'll get into the meat of it, which really is what I think people here probably the most interested in. What's going to happen in the presidential election, how we're looking at the state of the Senate, and then the House elections if we have a little bit of time, or we can save that for Q&A. So the first thing, I will be honest and upfront. I do not like President Trump, former President Trump. I will not vote for him. If a member of my family were threatened, I would give some thought to it first. Maybe I would. But that's not my job here today. I'm not here to tell you all the reasons I think President Trump is bad or the upside of it. My lodestar, what I try to live by, is this quote by Roger Bacon: "Books must follow sciences and not sciences books." If the polls tell me it's going to be a close election, if the analysis says it's going to be a close election, my job is to tell you it's going to be a close election. So I didn't have to give this disclaimer 10 years ago, but today I have to give the disclaimer that what I say is not indicative of what I want to happen. It's honestly what I think is going to happen. And it seems like it gets harder and harder to separate the two every year in American discourse, but it's super important, especially in an academic setting. So this is important because the main scientific tool in an election analyst's arsenal is polling data. So we need to start out talking after 2016 and 2020, can we really trust the polls? The answer is yes, as long as we understand what it is the polls are really telling us. Now, anyone here, I'm going to pick on my friend Nate Silver. I'll come back and pick on ourselves, but anyone here who has followed this stuff probably remembers this graphic from 2016. Hillary Clinton, 83% chance of winning the election. Donald Trump, 17%. We know what happened. We even remember maybe this from 2020. President Biden is an 89% favorite to win the election. And you can say, yeah, well, Biden did win. Okay, but when you look at what the actual projections were, it wasn't supposed to be close. President Biden was supposed to win between about 350 and 400 electoral college votes rather than having it be 40,000 votes spread across 3 states. Okay, so to do this, I do have to talk to you a little bit about probability theory. All right, they really know how to pick them for this speaker series. Now, the grad school way, at a certain age, you might remember this. As my understanding, there would be no math. We're going to do this with no math. But if we were doing this the grad school way, we would talk about the binomial distribution and the hypergeometric distribution, and we're not going to do that because I would be run down with pitchforks. So instead, we are going to do it with cute babies, like really cute babies. All right, so, well, you know, I was 30 and it was time, and I met a wonderful girl and we got married, and we had our first baby, Judson. And Judson was just adorable, and as he got older, he got even more adorable. So we said, you know what, like, let's do this again. Okay, so we had another baby, and we had Will, and Will looked like a little bit of a lizard at first. They don't really prepare you for that in parenting class. But as he grew older, he got to be pretty cute as well. So at this point, I'm like, okay, I'm married, I have 2 kids, we don't have the dog yet, but we're pretty close to the American dream. Like, I'm good. My wife, on the other hand, was Miss Massachusetts 1998. Yes, I am bragging. She is very much a girly girl. She really wanted a daughter. And she comes to me and she says, Sean, let's do it again. We can have a daughter. It'll be great. You can take her to daddy-daughter dances. And then when she gets to the teen years, I'll have like a best friend that I can talk to. And I'm thinking, yeah, but then she starts dating and we're probably gonna have, it doesn't matter. It's fine. We'll do this. We will have a daughter. We got together and now we have 3 sons.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. So when we found out before we gave birth what the gender was going to be, and when we heard it was a boy, my wife turned to me and said, "Oh my God, what are the chances of having 3 kids and they're all boys?" And I said, well, actually, that's about 12.5%. And that is why I'm an elections analyst and not a marriage counselor. I got this look. I get this look a lot. But the truth of the matter is, actually, yeah, that's exactly what the chances were of having 3 kids and all boys. How do I bring this back to this? Why trust the polls? Well, when people looked at this and saw 17% of Donald Trump win. See, we have this tendency when we look at percentages or probabilities to want to convert them to binary choices. We see 83% Hillary, 17% Trump, and we want to make it a yes, no. Okay, Hillary's going to win. That's not how it works, okay? Things that have a 17% chance of occurring occur 17% of the time. About 1 times out of 6. When people looked at this and saw that the polls were showing that Donald Trump had a 17% chance of winning, the proper interpretation was, well, if we were to run this election through 6 times, Donald Trump's going to win 1 of them. If we run it 60 times, he's going to win 10 of it. Are we that 1 time? I don't know. As it turns out, yes. But that's the trick with percentages. You know, I think things that have a less than 17% chance of happening, like the meteor of death putting an end to all this, is about 1 in 1.95 billion chance of that happening. Like, that's a really long shot, okay? Chance of getting struck by lightning, 1 in 960,000. And I think that's how people treated that 17% chance, okay? And then now the thing is, that's really rare, and yet we hear about people getting struck by lightning all the time, right? Like, it's not like something I've never heard of, and it's not something actually that has happened that far from me. There have been times where I'm like, oh, that was a little close, okay? That's 1 in a million. That's not 17%, okay? Russian roulette, 1 in 6 chance. That's roughly what the probability was of Donald Trump winning that election, according to the polls. Now, if you were given the opportunity to play, I'm guessing no one here would play Russian roulette because that one chance of it happening is very real. That's how you treat a 17% chance of Donald Trump winning an election. Okay, having three boys and having three kids and having all of them turn out to be boys, 1 in 8 chance. Not that unusual, right? Like it may seem unusual in the moment, but if you see a family with 3 kids and they're all boys or all girls, nothing's weird there. Okay, yeah, I know, honey. Flip a coin 3 times, whatever the outcome is. Okay, whatever the outcome is, that was a 1 in 8 chance of it happening. Tossing 3 heads in a row isn't that unusual. Donald Trump winning an election that he had a 17% chance of winning, according to the polls, isn't unusual. Polls have real uncertainty associated with them, and we want to brush it aside because we want the comfort of that yes or no answer. Probability will never give us that comfort of the yes and no answer. It can just give us kind of a baseline expectation to work with. All right. This isn't just some post hoc rationalization I've come up with. People were talking about this before the election. I will pat myself on the back. You can see the timestamp from November of 2016. Systemic poll errors do happen. We had one in 2014 of about 4 points towards Democrats, and in 2012 about 3 points towards Republicans. So let that sink in. If we had an error like we had in 2012, except the other way, Trump probably wins or this goes to overtime. Okay, no one wanted to hear it. You can see there's 39 likes on that. Because people want the comfort of the yes or no, especially when the yes or no is pointing the way they desired, right? People who really wanted Hillary Clinton to win saw that 83% chance and they rounded it up to 100%. Not a criticism, totally human reaction, but it's something we have to resist, okay? So what do the polls show now? Well, this is Trump v. Harris. Right now in national polling, on average, Harris is up, today it's up to 1.7%. This is as of Friday. She's up about 1.5% in the national polls. Now, as you may have heard, in America, we don't elect our presidents by the national popular vote. We do it through the Electoral College. As of right now, we have it 257 Harris Waltz, 281 Trump Vance in the Electoral College. Okay, this is just, the polls are what they are. Now, there's an asterisk here in case you weren't traumatized enough by Bush v. Gore in 2000. Pennsylvania, our average shows a tie. I don't think this has ever happened while I've been at RealClearPolitics. A poll average that shows a dead tie in a state that's likely to be the keystone state for the election. Now, why do we call it for Trump in our no toss-ups board? It's because there's that one poll for Harris that has her up 4 and everything else is tied or Trump. So we just put a thumb on the scale for it being a Trump state, but realistically it's tied. Josh Shapiro just kind of looks at this and says, it could have been me. A quick Q&A if you want, like this was the obvious choice to me. But anyway, other states, Michigan, we have Harris up by 0.8 of a point. Wisconsin's a little bit better for Harris. She's up by 1.8 points, although we have that Bloomberg poll is kind of an outlier, showing her up 8 points. Most of the other polling shows it to be very close. Arizona, Trump's up by about 1.5 points. Georgia, up by 0.3 of a point. I kind of ask myself, do I really think Trump's going to do worse than Herschel Walker, who very nearly won that Senate race? Maybe. Bottom line, it is a close election right now. After all the craziness we've been through, a lot of this is post-debate polling at this point. It is close. So some basic thoughts about where things stand. Once again, it is close. You may think it shouldn't be close right now, and I actually kind of agree with you. That's not good for Harris. After basically 6 weeks to 8 weeks of great news, of kind of events that, not because of any type of media bias, but just because that's how the calendar worked out for her. You know, she became the presidential nominee. She got her vice presidential selection. She had the convention. The calendar was just perfect for good news cycle after good news cycle after good news cycle for her. Honest reporting would have played out that way. It's tied in the Electoral College. That just being perfectly honest, that's not great. Trump has an Electoral College edge at this point. The big question we should be having from history is, will Trump overperform in the polls this time? And now, having picked on Nate Silver, I will pick on us. This is what we showed for the Electoral College in 2016. Clinton, Kaine, 340, Trump, Pence, 198. Trump overperformed the polls massively in 2016. And then all the pollsters assured us, okay, we know what the problem is. We weren't getting enough whites without college degrees. We've fixed that for 2020, and 2020 polling was, if anything, even worse. So how much do you read? And then this is like our state polls for 2016 in Colorado. Clinton was up 7, and Pennsylvania, Clinton was up 9. Colorado was much closer. Pennsylvania, Trump, of course, won. So there is this tendency for Trump to overperform his polling, and you would look at a effectively tied race and say, wow, that's really not good for Democrats. So here is my caveat, you can take this to your cocktail party and play this the next time the person says, yeah, Trump always overperforms the poll. Beware n equals 2. Okay. It is true, 100% true, that Trump overperforms his polling. It is also true that that has happened twice. Lots of things happen randomly twice. Okay. If it wasn't unusual to have 3 kids and have them all be boys, it's even less unusual to have 2 kids and have them both be boys. Okay. We don't know why Trump has overperformed his polls twice. And the chances that the polls will be 100% directly on are effectively 0. So someone always overperforms the polls. The fact that it was Trump twice, not that unusual. As I said in that Twitter thing that I had up, in 2012, there was a polling error of about 3 points that favored Obama. No one paid attention because the polling error just kind of confirmed the binary choice that the polls were showing. But polls are off a couple points. They can be off either direction. So be aware that pollsters adapt. Be aware that 2022 was actually a pretty good election for polling. If anything, the Democrats overperformed the polls a little bit. We should also remember that 2020 was a weird polling environment. Lots of people were home. Democrats were more likely than Republicans to be staying home because of the social distancing, the way it got filtered through our politics. That could be one of the reasons why the Republicans overperformed. We just don't know. So yes, keep tucked away the possibility that Trump might overperform, but you should also know Harris could overperform as well, because that's how poll errors work. All right. Just in the interest of time, I'll skip over that. Did the Tuesday debate matter? No, debates don't matter. Oh, all right. So debates typically don't matter. By the way, that was less than 3 months ago. That debate happened. The time warp or time extension in the Trump era is just crazy. Harris got the debate she wanted. I think we can be upfront and honest about that. The first few minutes, actually, I thought, wow, this is going pretty well for Trump. He's nailing his points on the economy. He's making the point. He's actually kind of calm. And then about 5 minutes in, Harris reached over and grabbed him by the comb over and dragged him around the stage for the next 85 minutes. It was a cathartic experience, I think, for Democrats who just wanted to see Trump get kind of beaten up or pantsed in a public environment. She did everything. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, like, she did everything but proclaim, "Are you not entertained?" Was this debate the debate she needed, though? You can think of relationships, like there's things that people want in a relationship, but it's not necessarily what they need in the relationship. It's a similar thing for Harris. Yes, it was cathartic for her base and probably rewarding for her to beat President Trump up. What did anyone learn about President Trump in that debate? Nothing. That he's kind of a jerk, that he doesn't always make sense, that he rambles, that he insults people. All these things are known. I think there's something in the anti-Trump mind. And again, this is me to some extent, that I'm speaking from experience, that like you think like, okay, if we can just expose him one more time, it will just sink in. No, everyone knows about Trump. And so having a debate about Trump doesn't advance the ball for Vice President Harris at all. She needed the debate to be about herself. An opportunity for her to explain plans, to talk, and she did some of that, but it just got overridden in the noise, which is what has happened in every debate President Trump had. He's won one debate of the presidential debates that he's been involved in, and that was the one against Joe Biden. And yet, here we are. So it's not that surprising to me that she hasn't gotten much of a post-debate bounce, because she didn't use the debate to do what she needed, as rewarding as the outcome probably was for her and her supporters. Okay, again, in the interest of time, if I have time, I'll come back to this. One final thing for you to keep in mind about elections, and this is one bit of historical perspective I actually kept. There's this famous quote from Albert Einstein, as I've said so many times: God doesn't play at dice with the world, but he does play dice with United States elections. Sorry, honey. Elections are fundamentally random, and this is something you should keep in mind going forward. There have been 43 presidential elections since the Republican Party first put its foot in the ring in 1856. Let's say instead of voting, we had decided them by coin flips. Okay? And then we went back and we said, okay, like how many times would we expect a party to win 4 times in a row? Yeah, just by coin flips, you would expect it to happen 4 times. It's happened 3 times. How many times would you expect a party to win 2 out of 4? Pretty close to what we would expect. What about like 5 out of 6? We'd expect that 5 times, it occurs 4 times. You can run through it, and to put it in stats geek terms, our elections follow a binomial distribution. To put it in normal person terms, if we decided it by coin toss, they would look almost identical to how they turn out. This is not the last election. If Harris were to win, the Republican Party is not vanquished. It will come back in the next election and have probably a 50-50 chance of winning it, because that's how our presidential elections have behaved for over 150 years now. So just something to stash away. All right. So the Senate, it's a safe bet for Republicans, right? No. All right, but it's less depressing, right? I mean, this is the chamber of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and Everett Dirksen and Daniel Moynihan. No, it's just, if you're following it closely, it's every bit as depressing. This is an actual headline for the Ohio Senate race where I am residing. Fact check: did Senate candidate Bernie Moreno shred documents accusing him of wage theft? Now, in a kinder, gentler political environment, you would expect to see Bernie Moreno pushing back on this, giving a reasoned explanation of how litigation works. Instead, Moreno says, the reality is the judge is a Harvard elitist lunatic. This is where the party of Bob Taft is today. Republicans are favored to take the Senate, which is going to be a problem if there is a Harris presidency. Right now, Republicans need 1 to 2 seats. That West Virginia Senate seat, even the most optimistic Democratic partisan I've talked to concedes that Senate seat is going to a Republican. So if we have President Trump, he's almost certain to have control of the Senate. If it's President Harris, Republicans need 1 more seat. There are 2 seats where they have just very good chance of winning. In Montana, John Tester has been senator there since 2006, but he is behind in almost every poll that's come out. You think about the task before him. This is a state that Trump is probably going to win by 20 points. So Tester needs to convince 1 in every 5 Trump voters to also vote Democrat for Senate. It's a really heavy lift for him in our current polarized environment. And if you look at it, that is seat number 51 for Republicans if it were to flip. So it's not a done deal, but it's not looking great for Democrats to hold the Senate. And then you have my state of Ohio. Sherrod Brown, also elected in 2006. He's leading Moreno, who did in fact shred documents because in litigation where he was being sued for not paying his employees, which would normally not go well. He's not leading, but Brown is down at like 46% in the polls. Brown has been in public office in Ohio since 1974, so there's not much that's not known about him. If you haven't made up your mind whether or not you're going to vote for Sherrod Brown at this point, the chances actually are pretty good you're not going to vote for him. And he has a similar problem to that of Tester. It's not as severe, but Brown has to convince 1 in every 10 Trump voters to also pull the lever for him as the Democrat. In our current polarized environment, it's a heavy haul. All right. What if things go really badly for Democrats? And I think this is a tail end possibility that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in discussions about elections, but it's again something that I think people should be aware of. In 2016 and 2020, there is exactly one Senate candidate who won their race while their presidential candidate was losing. That's Susan Collins in Maine, okay? And Susan Collins is a political athlete. She's a political freak. Maybe Joe Manchin could have done something similar. I'm not even sure Susan Collins will be able to do it the next time she's up in a presidential year. So we have this raft of Senate races that are actually pretty close where the Democrats are doing well. But if you look at history, or at least recent history, you say, okay, what happens if Trump does win all these states? For example, Michigan. This is an open Senate race where Elisa Slotkin has opened up like a 5-point lead. Still a lot of undecided voters. In 2020, Donald Trump almost carried John James across the finish line in a kind of shocking result in Michigan. So if he wins Michigan, I think there's a good chance this seat goes. Bob Casey Jr., also a senator from 2006. You will notice a trend here. 2006, 2012 were very, and then 2018 were very, very good years for Democrats. This is the first time that a lot of these Democratic Senate candidates are running in a not so great environment for them. Bob Casey Jr., up about 3 points in the polls right now. Also well below the 50% mark. This is another one where if Donald Trump wins the state, Casey is going to be sweating it on election night. Wisconsin, if Donald Trump wins the state, Tammy Baldwin is probably going to be sweating it on election night. She's in a little better shape because she's above 50% in the polls, but if there's any type of poll error, she falls behind. Now you start running the total in your mind and we're getting up to like 54, 55 Republican senators. Arizona, this one would probably be done if Republicans hadn't decided to repeat Carrie Lake, who is about the only candidate from 2022 who refused to concede that she lost on election night. Yes, it's a 7-point lead. It is buttressed by this kind of older 15-point lead from Fox News of all sources. It's a close race right now. If Donald Trump wins the state, there's a decent chance that Carrie Lake wins the Senate. Nevada, this actually kind of surprised me that Senator Rosen is doing so well while so many other of the incumbent senators are in close races. But again, if Donald Trump wins this state, probably tightens. Then we have the stretches. Larry Hogan, who's actually doing very well in the polls. He's a very popular Republican governor of Maryland, but he has the John Tester problem in reverse, right? He has to convince like 1 in probably 4 Democratic voters to also vote for him for Senate. So things would have to really go south for Democrats for this to flip. There are a couple of Democratic chances. Rick Scott in Florida is looking surprisingly weak in the polls. Ted Cruz in Texas, surprisingly weak in the polls. But again, we expect Donald Trump to win in those states. Unless things fall apart, these senators probably survive. So there is very, very real downside risk for Democrats in the Senate races. It is not, it's within our 95% confidence interval, if you will, to get up to like 56 or 57 Republican senators without the bottom completely falling out for Democrats. Right now, it looks like 51 Republicans, maybe 52, but again, the tail is longer on the Republican side this election. Finally, the battle for the House is close. There's no other way to put it. This is one, right now Republicans have a tiny lead in the House, about 4 seats. Right now, Democrats do have a lead in the popular vote, but there's a lot of undecided voters. The kind of conventional wisdom, and this is one time where I do agree with the conventional wisdom, is that the House is going to go the way the presidential election goes. It's close like the presidential elections. As a matter of fact, you'll notice the Democrats' margin of 1.3 points is almost the same as Harris's lead in the polls right now, and that's sort of what we expect. Obviously, there could be 1 or 2, a couple seats either way could make a big difference, but your kind of rule of thumb is that this is likely to follow the presidential election. I got through everything in a reasonable amount of time. I'm surprised. The one thing I do want to say, and sometimes this feels discordant, but at the end of the day, it's going to be all right. I've given, following elections right now, it used to be the greatest job in the world, and it's just not. It's just become so nasty and discordant. I do have to stop every now and again and remind myself, like, what really matters in my life, that no matter what happens, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to have my family with me, and I'm going to have like an adorable little son, even though he's 11 now, wanting to share Raff with me. The politics do matter, and for some people it matters a lot more than it matters for me. But at the end of the day, I do believe that in this country, everything is going to be all right when we eventually resolve the 2024 elections, hopefully by November 11th. And with that, I will take any questions y'all have.
Let me just mention also, because I think I neglected to say that for our friends on Zoom, if you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll be monitoring there.
Who are the people who answer all the polls? My phone rings all the time. I'm not that young. I've never answered any kind of a poll. So who are the people who are giving all the statistics?
This is a huge problem for modern polling. And it is an excellent question, because the golden era of polling was like the 80s and 90s, where you could just like random digit dial, everyone picked up their phones, and then caller ID got invented. And then iPhones got invented. And there's actually laws regulating how you can call cell phones. They actually date back. Remember when you had to like pay for every minute on your cell phone? Congress passed a law that said you can't auto dial cell phones to help protect people from that. And there's not a big constituency to overturn that. Spam callers don't have a lot of sway in public opinion. So anyway, you're absolutely right. Response rates used to be up at 90%. Now they're down at like 5%. And the people who pick up the calls tend not to be normal people. It's like it's someone who wants to talk to a pollster.
Highly prejudicial.
Sorry. I will talk to the pollster just because I feel like a civic obligation to do so, but I'm not a normal person, right? I'm someone who follows elections for a living. So there are techniques that pollsters have used to try to account for the fact that their samples don't look anything like America. But then the poll starts to become like the pollster's guess of who's going to vote rather than a truly scientific endeavor. So that is part of why we have seen those misses in 2016 and 2020 was the answers weren't as good. You should have some comfort that the polling in 2022 was so good, but it is, your question is spot on. If it doesn't sound like I've given a very compelling answer, it's because there's not. It's a big problem for polling, and until they really figure out how to do internet polling well, it's going to continue to be a problem for the industry. Yeah.
Why do we put so much attention on the national poll when we have the Electoral College?
Because the networks who sponsor the polls are in all 50 states. And if they just ran the poll of Pennsylvania, 49 of the states would kind of zone out. It's a business thing. We are very thankful for the pollsters who go in and do poll the individual states. It's why I spent a fair amount of time going through the individual states, because you're absolutely right. But it's a business model of how to convey news to the American people. People want to hear about the national polls that they feel included in. The other thing is that most people don't, they might know or intuit about the Electoral College existing, but if you showed them a poll of Pennsylvania, most people wouldn't know that that's likely to be the swing state in the upcoming election, and so they're more likely to tune it out. But it's bad reporting.
Can I ask a question? And that is, the voters who are 18 to 25, how do they figure into your projections? Are they likely to follow the projections come out in the numbers that Harris would hope that they would?
Yeah, the youth vote this election is an interesting thing because the polls are actually suggesting they're not quite as democratic as previous youth votes have been. Some of that's expected. It's been kind of a rough 4 years, especially for younger people getting started. And even if you don't think the Democrats deserve the blame for it, we always blame the party in power for Americans.
I guess I should get a microphone. Do you, for the young people, do you use internet or text? Do you text them questions to poll to get different personas or different age groups?
Yeah, so the question, the follow-up is, how do we reach younger voters who have cell phones? And it's a problem. That's the demographic that misses the most. There was actually a pollster in 2016 who was always showing Donald Trump up 6 points. And the reason was, in their internet panel, they had one black voter who was aged 18 to 29 who was a rabid Trump fan. And so when they would weight his vote to try to make it look like America, it would look like young black males were voting 100% for Trump. It skewed the entire sample because we know that's not how it's going. So it's a big problem. The internet panels will give people free laptops to take their polls on, so that's one way to reach them. But I'm going to keep giving this answer about the demographics of the polling of poll respondents. It's a problem. There are techniques that help us improve, but they're not foolproof, and they're part of why we've had these poll errors in certain years.
I have a question from an online viewer who wants to know your thoughts, and I'm hoping you can do a thorough debunking of Alan Lichtman, if you have any thoughts on his, whatever he calls his snake oil that he sells on the networks.
This is recorded, right?
Can you explain who that is first?
Yeah, so Alan Lichtman has this model called the keys to the presidency that gets a ton of news coverage. Dr. Lichtman is a well-regarded historian, but his model is a lot of things like who has the greatest charisma. Well, who gets to determine who has more charisma, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? I don't know. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't appeal to me, but there's people who would walk over hot coals to vote for him. There's no objective answer to that question. And there's a lot, there are some things in the model that are objective. There's these 13 factors, and about half of them are what I would call objective. And half of them allow Dr. Lichtman to kind of look at it and say, I think Harris is probably going to win, so she must be the most he can fill in the keys backwards, in effect. And that's the real problem with it. Political science models tend to derive from data, right? What's the president's job approval? What's real disposable income growth been? Who's the incumbent? Things like that. So it takes the subjectivity out. The keys to the presidency approach has a ton of subjectivity in it that allows it to kind of reflect Dr. Lichtman's kind of view of how the election is going, which is kind of like a researcher's thumb on the scale. So I would just be cautious of that model. It also missed an election because 1 year it calls the Electoral College one way and the popular vote another way, 2000. And then in 2016, it's the opposite. So one of those two elections it misses. It's always shown as having projected everything, but it hasn't.
I have a number of Zoom questions, but we'll start with one. How do you figure in the impact of voter turnout to protect pro-choice rights?
So the key, I think, to reproductive rights is going to be the Senate. If Harris were to come in and have control of the Senate, she can get her judges confirmed. There's a chance she could pass I can't think of the name of the bill that would codify Roe v. Wade. But then that comes down to, like, do you live in Montana or not? Look, if you care deeply about politics, you should vote regardless of what state you live in. People say it doesn't make a difference, but it often does. But because we have such state-specific elections in the U.S., it really does come down to, like, for reproductive rights, it does come down to, like, Ohio and Montana.
I'd like you to talk some more about Pennsylvania. It seems that perhaps the result of the presidential election might differ because of the fact Shapiro wasn't selected as the vice presidential candidate. But is it also likely that because Shapiro wasn't selected, that Casey might lose?
Yes. Yes, I mean, there's a couple things that people vote for president, not vice president, and I don't want to overstate this. What can a vice presidential candidate do? They can, like, send a message, like reinforce a message, like when Bill Clinton picked Al Gore, and it's like, no, really, I am a different kind of Democrat. Or they can help deliver a state, like LBJ did for JFK. In a very, very close election, yeah, Josh Shapiro could have made a pick. It's why I was critical of the Walz selection. I know the Democratic base loves him, but the Democratic base was already ecstatic over Kamala Harris. Minnesota is not a swing state. It's not a state that's likely to swing the election. But yeah, there's also this vice president, this very close Senate race, probably in Pennsylvania. And so if Shapiro would have added a point or two to the Democratic total, which is totally reasonable, that pick could be a difference in whether or not Casey comes back or whether it's McCormick.
I have a question about the Electoral College. Can you talk about any efforts to reform the Electoral College? Is it impossible to at least move away from the winner-takes-all model?
So there's this international, or not international, there's the National Popular Vote Compact, which some states have passed, which basically says 270 electoral votes worth of states sign this contract. We will agree, all of us, to cast our vote for the popular vote winner. In other words, our electors will be tied to whoever wins the national popular vote. That's it. And it's one of those things that gained a lot of momentum in states like California and New York, and then it just kind of, as you started to get into redder and redder states, ran out of momentum. It's closer than you'd think. I think it's up to 220 electoral votes worth of states have signed on to it. It's just those last 50 are really tough. And you have to convince smaller red states to kind of give up their leverage, which is the real trick. Like, Pennsylvania has a lot to lose if it gets out of the Electoral College. So I'm going to try to be a little shorter with my answers because I know there's a lot of questions. Any one of these would be like great dissertation topics. These are great questions.
Thanks, Sean. I had a quick question. With the second Trump assassination attempt, I was wondering how that has affected the polls or what you think the downstream ramifications of that event could be.
So the kind of short answer is it probably energizes the Republican base. The deeper answer is how much more energized could our bases get right now? I think it has less effect. I think the first one, the only reason it probably had an effect was Trump. I mean, I think I've impressed. I don't really like the guy, but his reaction where he was like fist pumping with the blood coming out of his ear, like even I looked at it and I was like, okay, wow, that's something. That's not what I expected from him. But at this point, I think the bases are already juiced up.
You've addressed questions about the representativeness of the sample of the polling and the difficulty of getting certain populations. My question is about the people who say one thing in a poll and do another thing in the election, people who are embarrassed to say that they will vote for Trump but are not embarrassed when in the polling booth to vote for him. That speaks to the validity of the results. How do And that's what scares me about the upcoming election. Could you speak about that, please?
I teach survey methodology, and there's like one sentence I repeat over and over to my students because everyone kind of believes it, but no one really internalizes it. People lie. People lie all the time. People lie about stupid things. They lie about big things. In 2008, you may recall there was a woman who claimed that Barack Obama supporters had held her down and you can Google this, and carved a bee into her face. And she had a bee on her face, except it was backwards. And someone realized that actually you would only do it backwards if you were doing it with a mirror. And it turned out she had made it up. She carved a bee into her own face to claim that Barack Obama supporters had done this to her. Okay, so yes, people will absolutely lie to a pollster and say, I'm voting for Kamala Harris when I'm really voting for Donald Trump. One thing that keeps me awake at night with these polls. The other thing is that we talked about people who will answer the polls. One of the kind of lodestones of Donald Trump's support from going way back to 2016 has been, I'm glad you asked that because now I can pull this slide back up after I keep clicking and clicking and bringing back lots of bad memories for you. Okay. Even after you controlled for people's attitudes towards anti-Hispanic sentiment, anti-Muslim sentiment, what stuck out even as early as 2016 for supporting Trump was agreeing with the statement, people like me don't have any say. Donald Trump's core support has always been people who are just utterly detached from society, who just feel like they're not a part of it. It's why when you go down rural roads, when you get out from Missouri to Missouri, you see like the Trump signs everywhere, right? It's the people where like when you drive by and you're like, who lives there? And it's like, oh, it's a Trump supporter, okay? That has consequences for the polls because these are not people who, when the company calls and says, this is MSNBC, would you like to answer a call? Click. Right? And there's no way to wait for that. Social trust is kind of the political science buzzword. There's no way to wait. We can wait for demographics because we know the demographics of America. We don't know what percentage of Americans have low social trust. So those are the two things that keep me awake at night where I say, okay, maybe this like Trump overperforming the polls isn't just an N of 2. It's something kind of inherent to his supporters, just not wanting to talk to pollsters.
Another Zoom question. Are these elections going to be fair? And are they going to be decided in a timely fashion? And if you could define timely fashion for me personally, that would be helpful. Thank you.
By November 12th. You know, the interesting thing about that question is that I don't know anything about the commenters' politics. Because this is a true, both sides have their versions of what makes a fair election, right? The Republicans think there's voter fraud. Democrats, when they worry about fair elections, are thinking more in terms of vote suppression. The political science on this suggests that things like voter identification laws and things don't have the suppressive effect that you would expect. The other side of this, though, is that the political science is even more convincing that there's very, very little voter fraud. People overstate that and say there's no voter fraud, and that's not true either. It's just like hundreds of votes, not millions of votes. So I do think the election will be fair. Whether it will be resolved in a timely manner, no, I do not think that. Right now, everything we have suggests this is going to be a close election. And if anything, since Bush v. Gore, the parties have just invested millions and millions and millions into the legal strategies for combating elections. So this thing is likely to be litigated for quite some time.
And then I was just wondering if you can talk about 2028 and what you see coming and yeah. Who is coming?
Oh, gosh.
That would be helpful.
Well, of course, if Harris wins, then Harris is the Democratic nominee almost certainly, assuming she doesn't lose the first debate. She'll be the Democratic nominee in 2028. For the Republicans, I mean, you know, Donald Trump is getting old. And is it above him to run again? No, I don't think so. But I like to think that the baton would be passed if he loses. Who it gets passed to, I mean.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
You know, I mean, J.D. Vance probably.
Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley thinks he's running.
Yeah, I don't think he really has the national Like, there's just too many people like the Marco Rubios and the JD Vances that just have larger national, even the Ted Cruzes just have, it doesn't mean you necessarily like them anymore, but they just have more of a national presence than Holly.
So I know that you're a pollster and not a campaign worker, but what have you heard about what the Democrats are doing to be sure that each election is fair and honest and to the best of anybody's? What are they doing to combat what have you heard?
Yeah, so both, again, this is something where both, the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, and then actually that 2008 contested Senate race between Al Franken and Norm, it's Coleman, was really the catalyst where the parties thought, okay, like these things are increasingly going to be litigated. And so both parties have invested millions and millions of dollars into ballot security and poll security process. They will have poll watchers documenting when people get turned away from the polls, making sure that people cast their provisional ballots. The provisional ballot wars, if it comes down to, a few hundred votes, if you don't have your photo ID or you aren't registered in the right place, you get to cast a provisional ballot and they seal it. And then after the election, they'll go back and see if you really do conform to the law. Well, if we're talking about an election that's decided by 1,000 votes in a state, there's going to be nuclear war over every one of those provisional ballots.
I'm talking about the physical violence threats and all of that.
Yeah, so the outside of the world of outright suppression, there's this idea of intimidation, which is, the poll watchers having someone in their army fatigues, having your poll watcher dress up and say army fatigues and like eyeballing people as they come in. That is much more difficult to police. But again, because both sides are going to have watchers in every precinct in these swing states, the idea is to try to document it. And if the election does end up close, using that to try to sway a judge. But it's very difficult at the end of the day to tamp down on the intimidation factor. Now, if it's outright violence, I'll say I hope there's no outright violence. That's not terribly reassuring, but that Roger Bacon quote, all I can say is I hope there's no violence.
What's the past about violence? Has there ever been violence before?
Has there ever been violence before? We've
not heard of it.
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of poll violence. There was some concern in 2020 that, Donald Trump would have people outside the booths trying to, physically intimidate people not to vote. So in historical perspective, there hasn't been much, but we aren't living in normal times. So I just hope there is none.
I would just ask, as somebody so involved in polling, what do you see as the big changes on the horizon in terms of, different technologies and reaching these audiences that are hard to get to? And, the idea that a 3% response rate is sort of what we're going with here. Like, what are the changes that you expect to see going forward?
The polling industry basically has a choice. It either has to figure out how to make internet polling work or it's going to die, because that 5%, 3% response rate is only going to get lower and lower. And it's tricky because you have to, when you get to internet polling, it's no longer a probability sample. So a lot of our math has to be changed. And there's this problem that no one really has figured out. It's what I call the Heisenberg problem, which is when you put people in an experiment, they realize they're in the experiment and change their behavior. So with internet polling, you typically give people a laptop and you're like, every month we're going to see if you're going to respond or not. Well, they know they're being tested. It's not like a poll where you're making an on-the-spot situation. So over time, there's a chance your sample gets less and less representative. So, but that's it. That's the game. You can try texting people, but again, you have the problem of the people who are the most interested in politics are the ones most likely to respond to the texts. It starts to be like a self-identified sample. Probably the answer is for some ambitious billionaire to fund an institute where we go back to door-to-door polling. That's actually like the best polls we get are every now and again you'll get someone who like buttresses their sample with a small door-to-door thing, and that's people will talk to people generally who come to their door still, but that's astonishingly expensive.
I think it was 2 cycles ago, the Wiedenbaum Center did some polling of individuals, and we signed up a group of people and continually followed them through the cycle. How more accurate is that, and what kind of percentage of polls are done that way?
Public polls aren't, because again, that's something that takes a real investment of time and resources. You know, ABC News, it runs a poll, but it's almost like a vanity project, right? It's not their main thing. The other problem you have is that thing that like, if I were to enroll everyone here in a sample, in a survey of say, British cricket teams, right? The first time you answered it, it would probably be a pretty good representative sample of American attitudes on British cricket teams, right? Like it would be more or less random because no one knows much. Very few people know a lot about cricket. But then you think like, well, you know what? Like I'm going to get asked about this again, so I should probably know something about cricket. And so you'll go research it. And by the end of the sample, everyone in this room would have their favorite team. They'd be able to name the players, and you would look nothing like America anymore. And that's the problem with panel surveys, is that people learn they're part of the panel, and over time they adjust their behavior accordingly.
I know most campaigns have internal polling. Is that different than more of the general polling that we've been talking about? Do they have different strategies with it?
Yeah, so the kind of folk wisdom is that campaign polling is much better, and it is to a degree because their samples are like 50,000 people rather than the 500 that we get reported. But just remember, Hillary didn't go to Wisconsin for a reason, right? The campaign polling didn't think it was going to be a big vulnerability point for her. So the campaign polls have the same problems. They mostly make up for it in mass, you know, because they do so many people, they can do better weighting and have more accurate, but they're not infallible. And like I said, it's not just the public. Donald Trump didn't think he was going to win in 2016. No one thought he was going to win based on the polling because all the polling was off.
Yes, I hope. Oops. Is it on? I have a question for Andrew regarding like was just mentioned, the Wiedenbaum Center does do this poll, which to me sounds fantastic. And I wondered if we have any returns regarding the presidential election.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we invest hundreds of thousands of dollars every year in doing high quality polls. The focus on those has primarily been for academic audiences. So they're able to do survey experiments or things like that then get published in peer review research. So they are among the most expensive polls that we can do. One of the things we're working on actually is trying to have a more public facing sort of arm of that operation, such that when we do get those results in, we can put out a press release on, you know, the state of free speech in the nation. I don't know that I really want to, you know, be doing interviews about who's up or down in the presidential election, but those are sorts of things that we're exploring. If anybody wants to give us a big gift to endow the survey, we're all ears for that as well. But to Sean's point, I mean, the range in costs of a survey are pretty massive depending on the quality of that sample. Any last question?
Who is going to win?
I spent all this time talking about probabilities and you can't go.
Yeah, one of the things, if I may ask, Do they ever use Google? It seems like everybody uses Google. Is there any statistics to get out of that? But maybe Google won't cooperate with the public because they want to keep that data to themselves. But
So people do Google.
any analogy?
There's Google Trends searches that can be useful. So you look to see like, is Donald Trump getting more people Googling his name than Harris? But at a certain point that loses, of course more people have been Googling Harris because Donald Trump is known. Like, what are you going to find out about Donald Trump at this point? There's limits to those approaches as well. But yes, Google Trends and things like that have been in a more normal situation where you don't have like one brand new fresh face and one extremely well-known source. Those type of analytics can be very useful. Look, I would rather be Trump than Harris right now. To answer the question, I look at it and it's a very close race in the polls. Donald Trump does have this this history of overperforming that I don't think is just randomness. But the real answer is I think it's close. Like this is an election that could honestly go either way right now. Maybe given how the last 6 weeks have gone, you can't understand how it could possibly go either way. And I mean, I have sympathy for you. Donald Trump is polling better today than he has in any of the elections that he's run in. And I think you have to give at least some weight to that when you're trying to figure out who's more likely to win.
So before we thank Sean, I just want to remind everybody that Thursday morning at 8 a.m., we'll be welcoming back Jim Ballard, who is a former president of the St. Louis Fed and who's now the dean of the Purdue Business School. Our meeting will be at the St. Louis Club for that particular event, so I hope to see many of you there. And now please join me in thanking Sean for a really outstanding